speak here today about global terrorism and the role of its victims as an introduction to the work being done in the name of my daughter, Malki Arnold Roth, and the organisation that bears her name, Keren Malki. I've had occasion over the 12 years that have run since my daughter's murder, which was on the 9th of August 2001, to compare the experience that my family and I have gone through with the experiences that other victims of acts of terrorism with whom I've had the privilege of coming into contact have experienced. It would take much more time than is available for this discussion to be done properly, but there are certain common factors which I think, once they're expressed, help people understand what makes this experience so particularly isolating and difficult from the point of view of the people who are exposed to it, who undergo it, and some characteristics which make it so difficult for societies in which terrorism is being carried out to know how to deal with it adequately. And let me quickly say that the set of places in which society is having to grapple with terrorism almost precisely co-equates to the surface of the earth. In other words, there's almost no place anywhere today which can lay legitimate claim to being free of the danger or even of the day-to-day experience of terrorism. It's just that people don't recognize it. Most importantly, very often, people who are in government don't recognize it. The very first experience I had in meeting people who came from an entirely different background from my own came when I was asked to take part in a small delegation of Israelis who had lost loved ones to an act of terrorism and to travel to a European country where we would take part in the first ever attempt at a congress of terror victims. When I was invited, jumped at the opportunity because for me it was already clear that there were aspects of the awful things that we'd been living in our lives since that terrible day that I wanted to put into a context and understand how other people were dealing with these issues, because to me they just seemed so complicated and so difficult to get your arms around. Ultimately, the people who were organising this little group found 3 other people, 4 of us, prepared to set off to a European capital, and on the day before we were due to leave, somebody called us from the government office that was doing those arrangements and said, "We've just had a call from the people organising the conference, and they're suggesting to us that we don't come. The reason is that there's a considerable degree of discomfort at the idea that there'll be a focus on Israeli victims of terrorism." So naturally we went. And we found ourselves in a hall in a major university, in a city that was exceptionally gracious and beautiful, and filled with people who had, as you could see on their faces, some pretty heavy loads to carry. Just before this conference began in that European city, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. Please bear in mind that we Israelis, having been told that we weren't actually wanted at the conference, simply rolled up as members of the admission fee paying public and took our seats in the hall. The gentleman who tapped me on the shoulder introduced himself as a significant political figure in that country, and he said, "I'm aware that some steps will be taken to make it impossible for Israelis to participate here. I find that unacceptable, and I'm asking you whether you're willing to take part in the panel that's going to assemble in the next few minutes as soon as the conference opens. Are you willing to go up on the stage, and by the way, do you speak English? And are you willing to speak without being political?" Well, I gave him all of the answers that I was capable of giving. Yes, I certainly speak English, and I don't see this as a political issue, and if you're giving me the opportunity to speak, then I'm embracing it very willingly. So I took my place on the panel where everybody else was seated with their name and their country on a placard in front of them. Mine was not there, and one after another people got up and spoke, in some cases very movingly, in other cases I think rather formulaically. I was the last to speak, and I spoke only about the issues that I felt it was legitimate for me to share with others. The silence in my home, the difficulty of even speaking about the awful events that resulted in our 15-year-old daughter, needless to say, a very loved child, middle of our children, came after 3 boys and before 3 other girls. She called herself the meat in the sandwich. I explained to the crowd that in fact we've now discovered that she wasn't the meat in the sandwich, she was the glue that held us all together. And then I spoke about how difficult it was to address these issues with my own neighbours, that I could walk down the street of the city where I live, which is Jerusalem, and even though on the particular street, in the particular section of northern Jerusalem where I live, 6 children have been killed since the start of the Arafat War, which began on the day of Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, in the year 2000. 6 children on one street, it has an impact, and when you multiply that by the number of families in Jerusalem alone, before I start speaking about Israel, which is a much larger place than Jerusalem, where there are probably 1,000 families, by my calculation, 1,000 families in Jerusalem alone who have suffered the loss of a child or a parent or a sibling. When you take all of that into account, there's a lot of pain walking around, and there's a lot of dysfunctionality in the society around us that simply doesn't know how to deal with it. Conversations that don't happen. People who cross the street when they see you coming. Not because you've offended them, but because they don't know what to say. I understand that very well. I understand their difficulty. I don't think they understand my difficulty. These were the things that I said, and then I sat down. I was struck by a totally unexpected response. There was a group of women, only women, all dressed in black, all speaking a language that I do not speak, who gathered at the side of the dais, of the stage, to speak with me as I walked down. And somebody came over and translated what they were saying, and to simplify what was a very touching and complicated message, I think, what they said was, thank you for articulating things that we've been unable to say here in our country, in our society, over the 2 or 3 decades since we lost our loved ones. I have to say there was a turning point in my life, without being too dramatic about it. It was a moment at which I understood that the experience of people living in a society very different from my own, undergoing experiences that are really quite different from those that characterize the awful days when buses were blowing up in the center of Jerusalem and in other parts of Israel, and when terrorists were prepared to send somebody else's child into a supermarket or a pizza restaurant in order to blow up, just so long as some of us were taken with them. That was a certain kind of experience that is so unique and so incapable, I think, of being extrapolated, that for me it was startling to run into people who'd been through experiences which ended in the same way, but perhaps were predicated on different sets of assumptions. In any event, they too had lost loved ones. They too had found themselves engaging in a monologue with the society around them, and they too felt terribly isolated. Well, it wasn't just a turning point for me, I have to say. I had 3 colleagues there with me, as well as some political attendants who were accompanying us, and we were all struck by the way in which simply being a victim of this awful process called terrorism, where they set out to kill people deliberately without actually knowing those people, and where there is no crossfire. All of us had experienced that, and we found ourselves in the company of other people who had no background like ours, no claims about occupied territories, none of the paraphernalia that goes with making complicated the process of losing a child to an act of terrorism by Palestinian Arabs. The uniqueness of that situation suddenly was lost in an audience, in a crowd of people who all had their own individual stories. This was a European city. Not all of the victims were European, but most were. And they talked about the same kind of pain, the same kind of silence, the same kind of inability to communicate with the people around them, the same lack of understanding by the leaders of their communities. 2 intense days. At the end of the second day, the conference drew to a close, and as we were all taking our leave, somebody pointed to an official-looking man, I have to say a rather pompous official-looking man, who was making his way through the crowd. And one of the people close to us said, "That's the foreign minister." We converged on him. And somebody from our group, it wasn't I, it was someone with perhaps a little less political sensitivity than I claim to have for myself, said to His Excellency, that particular local politician, "Shame on you," he said, "shame on you for having treated us Israelis as persona non grata. And shame on you for having invited to this conference of terror victims representatives of the government of Iran, and if I remember correctly, Syria, as guests of honour. Shame on you." The political figure, clearly a diplomat, was absolutely unfussed and said, "You make some interesting points. Why don't we gather tomorrow in the Foreign Ministry and we shall have a discussion?" And we did. That discussion is etched in my memory because it represents a kind of crystallization of the things that I think are wrong in the way in which many societies are grappling with the issue of some parts of their population being exposed to terrorism and paying the ultimate price. We sat there for about an hour and the discussion began in a very proper and correct way and very quickly devolved into what diplomats like to call a full and frank exchange of views. The particular diplomat in question took his time before weighing into the conversation, but when he did, he was very irritated. He was what we call, in the country where I was raised, Australia, we call it the moment when he spat the dummy. He was very upset at something that had been said, and it forced him to say to us in a state of considerable irritation, "You know, you people, you're not really victims of terrorism. The people here in my country, they're innocent. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're victims of terrorism. It was for them that we had this conference. You're part of a political process. You need to go home and tell your government that it needs to deal differently with the people who you claim as the terrorists." And I'm a patient person, and I'm generally a fairly politely spoken person, but I got to my feet in this small gathering and I said, "I don't think you understand how terrorism fails to respect international borders. I'm not sure that you understand just how similar the process that we've gone through, are going through, resembles the state of terrorism in your own country. And don't be surprised if the character," I said, "if the character of the terrorism in your own country, which you claim to be pure terrorism and that's distinct from the somehow politically tinged terrorism in my country, crosses borders and arrives in your own country." And he made a statement which I won't go into now, which was, I think, pretty offensive, and we all got up and we went our different ways. 3 weeks to the day after that gathering, the trains exploded in Madrid, which is where we were sitting.
What year was that?
This was 2000, I'm embarrassed, 2004, 2005, I don't remember now.
Okay.
The trains exploded very shortly afterwards. The government fell, the government of José María Aznar, and the government of Spain quickly became a government that had to deal with an incomprehensible change in the political culture of the country. Local, Spanish-born terrorists, without any obvious grievance, without any real argument with the rest of us, saw fit to send their own people on trains, blow up the trains, and take hundreds of people with them. Hundreds of people were killed in this cataclysm that represented a turning point in the life of Spain. I'm not here to talk about Spain. I'm here to talk about the ways in which terrorism has a certain commonality, a sameness in its expression, irrespective of what one might consider the underlying political issues. Spain didn't consider itself at war neither with the Muslims nor with the particular Spanish individuals who were so terribly angry and so terribly disgruntled with something that they saw fit to blow themselves up and to take many of their neighbours with them. A more positive outcome of that rather unpleasant process can be gauged by the fact that in the subsequent year or 2 years, I was then a guest of the government of Spain 3 times. There was suddenly a perception in Spain that it would be interesting to hear what Israelis say about this war of terrorism, the war against terrorism, the war of the terrorists. And then I was not persona non grata, and found myself in settings where people were very interested to understand what it was that the Israelis had learned, if anything, about the hatred that causes people to get up one morning and to put a bag on their back and walk onto a train or into a pizza restaurant or onto a bus and blow themselves up only because of the very realistic prospect of taking people who they hate in principle, not because of anything that the other people have done, not because they know them well, not because of any specific outrage, but because, well, because. I've since had the privilege of speaking with and meeting and getting to know and listening to terror victims in numerous other places, in Ireland, in Colombia, in France, in Australia, in the United States. And at the human level, the experience has a persuasive sameness. Some factors that you'll see running through the narrative in all of those places, irrespective of the level of education or the language or the political grievance, if there is one, or any other external factor. The sameness of being a terror victim is striking. I saw another dimension in this when I had the privilege of being invited by the Secretary General of the United Nations to speak to the UN in a conference devoted to hearing the voices of terror victims in 2008, in September 2008. On that occasion, and again, the details are compelling but far too many, and it would take me a long time to go into all of them, so I'll be superficial, but that isn't to say that the story is superficial, it's not. There was tremendous resistance within the organs of the United Nations at the very notion that an Israeli representative would be invited at all. Because, as it was said by two of the representatives who were subsequently quoted to me, the Israelis are the cause of terrorism and not its victims. That's not the way it worked out in the end, and I'm pleased that the Secretary General, who I think was personally the initiator of this symposium on the subject of the experience of terrorist victims, decided that an Israeli voice ought to be heard among the 16 voices who were invited to come. There were all sorts of interesting consequences, and again, I don't really have the opportunity to go into them. I can only say that it would be fair to assess that there was not a universal agreement in the room that there was a common issue that embraced Israelis as well as Irish and Spanish and Moroccan and so on, but rather a certain political tension that resulted in a compromise. In any event, I was there, I think, as a result of a political compromise, and I had the privilege of getting up and speaking not only in the name of the State of Israel, but also in the name of my wife and me, addressing my daughter. That's in fact what I did. I addressed my daughter when I had the opportunity in the Chamber of the United Nations to speak about terrorism, explaining as much as I could how baffling it is for me as a father to contemplate what people are willing to do to other people in the name of terrorism. Since the terrible events of August 2001, the challenge faced by people like me, of course I'm going to say me, but also people like me, is what do you do? What do you do the day after your child is murdered? What do you do a week later, a month later, a year later? What happens when the first wedding invitation comes in? What happens when people stop you in the street and say, "Hey, how are you?" These are not small questions, and I don't believe that there's either a dummy's guide to dealing with the terror victim living on your street, or even any well-established practices, and I'll include well-established practices within Jewish life. I think Judaism has a fantastic, mature, sophisticated approach to dealing with bereavement, grief. It's highly structured. Those who know something about Jewish practices in mourning know that it begins with a period of 7 days in which pretty much every aspect of your normal life is put on ice, and you stay at home, physically seated in a low place, which reflects in a pretty accurate way your state of mind, and people come and try to give of their strength to you. In our case, it was, as much as I remember of it, an extraordinary experience, because most of the people who came through our house were people we'd never met before. And what motivated them to come was something that I think comes from a very high place. That is the desire to reach out, embrace, to give strength, and somehow share some of the burden. Now, that's not at all to say that every statement that was made by well-meaning people who came into our home was wise or calculated or had a happy result. Some people said things which I wish they'd never said. Foolishness. Foolishness in the interest of making us feel better, perhaps. Foolishness in their understanding of such concepts as the hereafter. You'll see your child soon because the Messiah is coming. These are not necessarily words of comfort to somebody who's going through the process of separating from a child whose entire life was right there in front of your eyes until suddenly somebody did something unthinkable and she's no longer there. I don't say that I know what the right formulation is. I only say that when you're in that process of mourning, that not every single dimension of it is uplifting and encouraging. But on the whole, this process of 7 days, followed by 30 days, followed by 12 months is really extraordinary. And I think that people who've gone through a process of bereavement in cultures that don't draw their source values from Judaism may very well be envious of the Jewish message when it comes to this process. But that's only at the most superficial level, because life goes on even after the 12 months. And losing, and it doesn't much matter whether it's a child or a loved one of a different degree, to an act of hatred, and I'm going to come back and visit the subject again in a moment, losing a loved one to an act of hatred has different kinds of consequences. I don't for a moment mean to suggest that losing a loved one, particularly a child, which is one of the most difficult challenges anybody ever faces, losing a child is ever going to be easy just because the child was the victim of an illness or a road accident or something else. There's an entire literature of dealing with such loss. The literature exists because it's such a challenge. But there's a much smaller literature for trying to address what it means to lose a child to an act of violence. And I can tell you that there's an almost minuscule and maybe not even existent literature for dealing with losing a child to people who are still active out there, who are actually encouraging the repetition of those acts of murder and who want to do it to your other children. And by the way, to you and to your neighbours. That's a literature which hasn't been written yet. And it raises, genuinely I think, genuinely in the sense of there are real issues here of psychology, of understanding the social fabric that we've created, issues which are almost never properly addressed. In this sense, Israel makes, I think, valiant efforts, but ultimately fails in the same way that every other society that I've ever seen fails. Nevertheless, I think that even in this respect, Israel has a great deal to be proud of, mostly, I think, because of fundamental Jewish values, but there's a lot of work still ahead for all of us. Being the parent of a child who's been murdered by people who absolutely intended to kill somebody like her, even if not her, makes it very difficult for you to embrace one of your other children who happens to be in the grip of some fear and say, there. There is no there after a child has been murdered. Murdered by a terrorist who wants to do the same to others. I'm going to jump from there to what we've done in response to the question I posed a minute or two ago. What do you do afterwards? Well, there's no formula that works for everyone. I can only speak about the tremendous role that chesed, a Jewish value which I think is the hallmark of Jewish life. Chesed is part of salvation. I can say without much doubt that chesed, acts of chesed, and I'm going to explain the word in a moment, are what has kept, in my case, me sane, and I think I've seen the same process in others. I hesitate to try to transfer onto other people what they may be going through, because as I've learned myself, you can't know by asking, you can't know by looking. In my case, I can say that it was terribly important during the 7 days of mourning, immediately after the trauma, the shock, the unfathomable loss, to sit with my children, with my wife, and to decide how is it that we will remember Malki's life. Now, as much as I'd like to, I could tell you a great deal about Malki, but I won't. We've created a website, which is at www.kerenmalki.org, and some big part of it talks about Malki herself. She was a real person. We weren't always the parents of a dead child. She was alive until the moment that she wasn't. She was 15 years old when her life came to an end, and it was a life packed with beauty and with very positive deeds. She had a very clear view of some of the things she wanted to do in life, and one of those things was that she wanted to care for disabled children, starting with her own youngest sister. When Malki was, I think, 9 years old, her youngest sister became terribly damaged as a result of what I would call a medical accident in hospital, and was left brain damaged and essentially incapable of communicating with the world. And that's how she is today. We're now at the point where she's 18 years old. Malki learned from the experience of having such a sibling that even though you're only a teenage girl, even though you don't have too much power, too many capabilities, even though most of what there is to learn in life is still waiting for you to learn it, discovered that there were so many things she could do with her own sister, provided that she had no expectation of getting anything back. It wasn't done because she wanted recognition. It wasn't done because somebody was going to pay her or she was going to get credits in school. This is the essence of chesed. It's when we do things that no one really expects that anything positive will accrue to oneself. On the other hand, as I've learned, as I've seen, being able to do acts of chesed, benefiting other people one way or another, enables you to look the world in the eye. And I cannot tell you how difficult it is to look the world in the eye after you go through the experience of losing a child to an act of terrorism. Malki was deeply involved in small acts, even not so small, of reaching out to children with disabilities. The summer before she was killed, and this is a girl who died when she was 15, so this is when she was 14, she said to her mother, I'm going to go out and find a mother with a disabled child. I want to be the mother's helper for this summer while I have my vacation. And she did. She found a young woman living in our neighbourhood whose child was diagnosed very young as having one of those Jewish genetic diseases, and everyone, as I say those words, is thinking of Tay-Sachs, but this is Canavan's disease, another disease which has a terrible focus on Jewish society and always has a terrible end. She found a young woman whose husband dealt with the issue of a child with Canavan's in the traditional way of walking out on her, leaving her alone. She then moved to our street in order to be close to the excellent hospitals in Jerusalem, and there she was with a child who's dying in front of her eyes and who needs daily care. Malki made herself a carer, and she spent much of those school holidays in the year 2000 simply being there to clean up this sweet little boy who could smile in such an infectious way, help feed him through his tube, and just be his companion. In the week before her life came to an end, she and a friend travelled to the north of Israel and forced themselves upon the organisers of a camp called Etgarim. Etgarim is a modern Hebrew word which you won't find in the Bible, and it means challenges, and that's a good characterization of what it does. It deals with the challenges facing children with special needs, both cognitively and physically. Malki and her friend, as I understand it, were the first volunteers allowed onto the premises, and somewhat begrudgingly, but it was a wonderful experience. She came home. She barely managed to tell us anything about this, and within a couple of days, that chapter in our lives came to an end with Malki's death on a hot Thursday afternoon in the centre of Jerusalem. Malki was standing at the Sparrow Pizza restaurant on the afternoon of Thursday, the 9th of August 2001, when a young man carrying a guitar case on his back walked in off the street a few minutes before 2 o'clock, walked up to the counter where Malki and her best friend were standing, and exploded. And Malki and her friend and 13 other people were killed on the spot, most of them children, and another young woman, a mother of a 2-year-old child, has been unconscious from that day until today. In addition, 130 people were maimed, not all of them in the restaurant, many of them outside on the street. The young woman who engineered the massacre was also the newsreader on Palestinian Authority television in Ramallah. She left the scene some minutes before the explosion, went straight to Ramallah from Jerusalem, and sat poised and calm in front of the cameras as she reported on the events of that afternoon in Jerusalem. She was subsequently caught by the Israeli authorities, charged and convicted in a court, and sentenced to 16 life terms, and walked free in October 2011 as part of the group of 1,027 terrorists, overwhelmingly murderers, who were set free as an exchange deal for the life of Gilad Shalit. part of the experience of being a victim of terrorism is dealing with the enormous injustice that often attends the way in which governments deal with the terrorists and are subject, the governments, to massive confusion over how one goes about dealing with terrorism. I'll be happy to share with any audience my thoughts about how governments ought to deal with this. At this point, I just want to say that what we did in Malki's name was to set up an organisation that reflected that positive, unconditional approach to supporting and loving people who are trying to raise a child with special needs on their own. We are such a family. We know that it's terribly difficult. The system, and this isn't the time to go into the details of the system, but trust me, anybody who wants to press me on it, I'll be glad to share with you my experience. The system doesn't support the families. The system basically undermines and even infantilizes the parents, because ultimately a system that wants to support parents would give parents support and strength. They don't, and therefore we do. Keren Malki's operation exists in order to empower the parents to make decisions for the benefit of their child on the condition that they see the future of the child as being in their own home, raising the child in their home, not handing the child off to institutional care. That's not a statement against institutional care. People need institutional care. People who see no alternative to institutional care should be able to embrace it, and it should be there. But what about the people who don't want institutional care? Sad to say, it's a real challenge, at least in my country, for families who want to take those responsibilities and those privileges into their own hands and give the child the care and the love that really only a family can provide, with all of the good results that come from that. As difficult as all of that is, we've tried to make it much easier by doing two kinds of things, and with this I'll finish. Keren Malki provides, first of all, an equipment lending service in conjunction with a wonderful organisation called Yad Sarah. We are full partners with Yad Sarah. We have a warehouse on the premises of Yad Sarah in Jerusalem. Yad Sarah is the largest lending organisation in the world. We have a big investment in equipment, most of which you can never see, because thank goodness the equipment is almost always out, and we just keep adding to the stock. Being able to provide a family with a walker, a stander, a bath insert, sometimes a special chair or a bed, makes all the difference between a family deciding, yes, we can do this, we can keep this child at home where we know the child will thrive by comparison with any other solution, and surrendering and handing the child off to institutional care because they don't have the chair or the stander or any of the other pieces of equipment. But that's just equipment. The other side of it is non-medical therapy. As a family trying to raise a child with severe disabilities, we know how terribly difficult it is to get the kinds of therapies that can make a big difference. So we've taken on 5 therapies, not as therapy providers, and I'll explain that in a moment. 5 therapies are physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, horse therapy, and water therapy. If your child lives at home, by this we mean sleeps at home every night, and has a significant disability, and is in Israel, then irrespective of whether that child is Jewish or Muslim or Druze or Christian or any other designation that is living in Israel, then our support is there if the family wants to reach out for it. We've provided, at this stage, somewhere between 40 and 50,000 therapy sessions to families right across the country. The rate at which we're providing therapies is, thank goodness, on the rise again. The rate at which we're providing equipment is on the rise again, and we think that the model that Keren Malki has embraced, in which we provide support via the family and not via other agents, is a winning formula. We think that it's a unique approach, at least in Israel. We know that it works. We wish that it could grow faster and be more impactful. This is only a function of money, and that's why I, as a non-employee, I don't work for Keren Malki. I'm the honorary chairman. My wife and I contribute whatever we can, but not as paid employees, have a day job. The organisation could do more if we raise more money. So, as you can imagine, the imperative of going out, visiting places far from Jerusalem, in order to try to encourage people to give us their support, is something that needs to be done as often as possible. And I don't mind saying that I'm happy to look people in the faces and say, money's not going to me, so please don't feel that this is a family business. It is in a certain way a family business because we're passionate about connecting Malki's memory to the work of Keren Malki, but it's not our source of parnasa, of living, and the money that is given is treated with enormous respect as what is called in halachic terms hekdesh. It's a religious trust. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to urge people to have a look and learn a little more about the work that's done. The website address is the one that I would encourage you to start with. It's not the one that I mentioned at the beginning. It's www.malkifoundation, MalkiFoundation.org. You'll see there a lot of information about the work that we've done over the years. You'll see some information about Malki herself, and I urge people to learn about Malki, about her life, and especially about the beautiful song that she wrote. Give us your support if you feel that you can. I don't think that there's a more effective way to help families in Israel who are coping with the challenge of raising a special needs child than by giving your support to Keren Malki. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.